Board. All right, welcome. Today at the New Jersey Environmental Fundraisers Gathering, we have Drew here from Veritus. Is that how you enunciate it?
Veritus, yes.
Yeah, Veritus. And we're going to discuss how to approach fundraising when your mission doesn't fit in a neat box, with a little bit of emphasis on major gifts. So take it away, Drew.
All right. Hi, everyone. Before I share my screen, I have some slides, but I'd love to hear your ideas. And if you have any questions or input, feel free to interrupt me or throw them in the chat. I have to recalibrate my presentation style from Midwest. So I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to more of my East Coast, specifically New Jersey persona. So I'll try to be more direct. Try not to swear much, but my experience in New Jersey is primarily in the South Jersey area. My family's from Philadelphia, and I spend every summer in Stone Harbor, New Jersey. So little south from you, but I have a profound love for turnpikes and diners. So I feel like I'm bringing something to the table today. So I will go ahead and share my screen. All right. I trust that's showing up for everybody. Make it a little bigger. So really, like Lauren said, today we'll be talking about what approach can you take, or what are some tips and tricks when your mission doesn't fit in a neat box. This is me, and I have to admit I'm always kind of shocked by the content, even though I wrote it. I'm a former attorney, now a coach with Veritus. My background is in fundraising and major gifts, but also writing and general comms strategy. So I hope I can be a good resource for you for sourcing and creating touch points, and just having some ideas about how to keep people engaged when it's not so easy to connect point A, i.e. their gift, to point B, some fabulous outcome. So moving forward, our objectives today really just to crowdsource and chat about what some of the challenges are. I'll present some slides from our best practices, and then I'd love to hear what you have to say. We can talk about some of the fundamentals of communicating impact when you're not working necessarily with like a direct service organization that X amount of dollars equates to Y number of meals served. And then we can talk even more deeply about how to create meaningful communications that deepen people's relationships with your mission, your organization, the individuals that serve it, even if they won't necessarily see the outcomes of their giving in their lifetimes. So charging right in, talk about some of the challenges with demonstrating impact in organizations like yours. Often, especially in sectors like environmental impact, long-term healthcare and health research, there are areas where it's really hard to show that connection between, if I give X amount of dollars today, how is my outcome going to be measured? Oh, I think somebody might not be on mute. If you could go ahead and mute your. All right. Additionally, it's hard to gather stories about your impact, especially if you are looking at missions that are writ large, like save water, save the earth. You can't necessarily go to the environment and say, well, watershed, please provide a testimonial about how our efforts have benefited you. Now, that would be great. And actually, that's kind of a compelling narrative if you could anthropomorphize a river, but that's probably not our first line of defense. Like I said, it's really tough when the impact is intangible. It might be years long or intergenerational, or frankly, it might be preventing something bad from happening, which is very hard to demonstrate without scaring your donors into giving. So just a few big pillars to keep in mind as we go along today. So where do we start? It really starts with you as the individual vanguards of your organizations. You know, we always say in fundraising, you don't want donors to necessarily fall in love with you individually, but they want to, you want to help them understand and feel closer to the mission. But at the end of the day, you are the communicator of that mission, especially when it's more difficult to demonstrate impact. So first and foremost, it's really important to do a gut check and figure out what it is about the mission that you believe. That core understanding of your own motivations is really central to growing and stewarding relationships with donors, because I think at this point, people can sniff out the pretenders and the operators and the people who are just trying to sell them something. And even though a lot of our job is similar to sales, it is so profoundly different insofar as we are selling something that requires an authentic belief rather than just a need to be filled. So as you examine what it is that compels you to engage with your organization, you can also ask yourself, um, why why do the people that I know well who are donors, why do they give? Um, and that can be going back through notes, that can be racking your brain about great donor visits. It can be reaching out and doing informal surveys with that handful of donors that will always pick up the phone when you call, even if it's just 5 minutes, just to refocus and to recalibrate and remind yourself and them, what is it that initially brought them to your organization? And most important, what keeps them engaged? What keeps them giving? So that's a really strong jumping off point for figuring out how to engage more deeply with other donors, to attract new donors, and to sustain the mission. So, how do we approach communicating that impact? Well, I work with clients all over the country in Canada, and central to both the major gift side and the mid-level gift officers that I work with is having a plan. Um, that can be as broad as saying, okay, over the next 12 months, I'm going to send this, and this touch point to everyone. Everyone gets this, all the way down to the most granular levels of saying, there is this one family that I would love to engage as deeply as possible, and I have tailored a bespoke communication plan to them. So really the crux of that is, as you get into that more granular layer of personalizing a plan for someone, it's really important to consider all the factors that make it personal. What does that donor care about? Why is it relevant to their life now? And where does that fall into the cycle of cultivation and stewardship, which is really central to the Veritus model, which is hopefully a nonstop cycle of engaging people in ways. And you'll see in the center, and I admit I'm gesturing madly at my own screen, which probably means nothing to you, but as I make this circle, I direct you to those kind of off yellow ovals in the middle of the screen, the touch point, the YMAD, the touch point. That itself, that's really the crux of your annual communications plan with a given major donor. It's introducing a variety of format, of content, of tone, and the alternating touch point really refers to something just to keep people connected to the mission. What's going on? What are the initiatives? What sort of advocacy are we doing? What are the outcomes that we're hoping for? And alternating that with a YMAT, a you made a difference piece, to really demonstrate that connection between someone's giving and the progress of the organization. And that's really the meat of what we're talking about today. Just to recenter in the challenge of communicating impact and communicating that difference that people make if the mission itself isn't built for really fast, measurable outcomes. So one of the specific tools that we can use, especially with organizations in the environmental space, is a, a thorough problem or gap statement. And this, I find that when I talk to fundraisers, identifying the problem that our organizations address is so deeply ingrained in all of us and so second nature that sometimes we forget to articulate it to donors and other supporters. But it's really important to take a step back from our day-to-day work because, frankly, we know the problem. That's why we exist. But, connecting those points in a donor's mind isn't quite as clear. So making a really concerted effort to say, okay, so this is the issue or the series of issues or the steps that need to be addressed. And that's why our organization is doing what it needs to do. That itself is a blend of informative, but also persuasive call to action for donors. So it's got to be that balance between not being too overly academic or statistics driven. And also, like I said earlier, not being doom and gloom and trying to scare people into contributing. There's got to be a clear, concise, compelling explanation of where the gap is and how your organization intends to fill it. On the other end, you have impact and project reports. This speaks directly to our challenge of communicating impact. But I urge you as you look at how best to articulate what it is you do and what you've accomplished to donors, don't get too big picture oriented. It's true that for some of our organizations, the mission is as broad as stopping something from happening that could deleteriously affect all of humankind sometime in the future. That is the reality of it, but that doesn't really make for a compelling postcard to donors. And likewise, after someone has given and has been informed on the overall call to action, it's not all that effective to send them a report that says, well, we put your money in a safe place and hopefully your children's children will benefit from whatever it is we do. Instead, I encourage you to take a look and break down into increments, whether it's time bound or by project, and list out exactly what it is you have accomplished. I don't think there are any organizations out there whose missions and singular focus areas are so broad that they can't do anything. Or if there are, they come and go pretty quickly. That was my experience as an attorney helping some bright and somewhat misguided entrepreneurs start nonprofits. Their missions were so diffuse and so big that there were no incremental steps. There were no markers of progress. It was all or nothing. But in your case, I know each of your organizations has markers that you can demonstrate to donors that say, we have taken this step. We have made this movement toward accomplishment of our ultimate goal, or we've accomplished X, Y, and Z sub goals of that. So it's really important to keep that balance in mind between the big picture problem that we talked about a little earlier, and then the ways to show that you are making progress. And the story of our whole experience in nonprofits is progress, not perfection, right? So moving on, this is an example of impact report. And this is one of my clients, the American Cancer Society. Similar to many environmental orgs insofar as, on a base level, ACS's mission is eliminate cancer. Now, if that were their only selling point and the only way they articulated what they do and how they use donors' money, they wouldn't be around for very long. Instead, you have this continuum where on one end of the spectrum, the big picture mission is eliminate cancer. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like American Cancer Society's Hope Lodges, which are physical spaces where people undergoing treatment and their families can stay when they're on site. That is a very tangible outcome. Now, in the middle, they have research, which is a blend of both big picture mission of curing cancer. Ultimately, research may lead to trials, which may lead to better outcomes. But at the same time, even if I were to give $100 million to my favorite research project, I wouldn't see an outcome in the way that you might think, X number of dollars equals Y impact for many years. So this is one way that ACS has done a really good job of finding that middle ground between their big picture, hard to articulate, hard to demonstrate impact, and the day-to-day operations. It's part numbers. So what they've done with their investments and their donors' money as good stewards of that, but also some of their aspirational efforts, like improving access to cancer treatment, the health equity, the screening, the early detection. So I think this is a really good example of an impact report that blends aspirational with pragmatic. This is a story, and I'm the type of presenter who tries not to just read and recite. So, and I know these slides will be available after, so I encourage you to go through and read some of our anecdotes. But this slide in particular speaks to organizations that deal with advocacy, which I know is the bailiwick of a lot of environmental orgs as well, and very hard to demonstrate when it comes to impact. I could go to a donor and say, if you give us $100,000, that's 2 hours of a lobbyist's time. They may or may not get in to talk to somebody, which may result in something going to committee, ultimately draft legislation passes, and then 30 years from now, we might have protected this watershed. That is not a compelling narrative for donors who want to know, what action are you taking now? So just something to bear in mind as we keep talking. Likewise, another story out of Texas. So continuing on, one of the most powerful things you can do, I think, especially in the environmental space, is bring people to where the work is happening, even if the goal and the mission are really big picture and maybe intergenerational. I think it's a matter of tying people's interests and existence now to the potential for either improvement or protection. I'm sure many of your organizations have volunteer opportunities. The environmental organizations I've worked with are often blends of specific geographic specific initiatives plus larger advocacy, but also day-to-day experiences like cleanups or conservation events, awareness. I've worked with land trusts here in Minnesota that really take pride in celebrating new properties coming into the trust. So, even though you might not be able to put down on a single piece of paper, mission accomplished, Earth saved, which would be great, and I would donate more to the environmental organizations I support if that were feasible. But I think, again, I encourage you to think hard about what impact you've made on even a single day basis. Has a particular area of a location been improved or protected? How does the continued sustained health of an area impact the people who live there? Again, this goes back to the question of almost like, how do you prove a negative? If you do your job correctly, sometime years down the road, something terrible wouldn't have happened. But I think the flip side of that for now and for how to speak to donors is demonstrating just how valuable and precious the potentially impacted space is. So the again, this slide, read at your leisure, but I think the takeaway here is is that, there are so many resources in our day-to-day lives as fundraisers that we may pass by, because we're so focused on big gifts and big impact. And so I encourage you to take a step back too, and in your cultivation and stewardship of donors, you may consider asking them about their inspiration and their interaction with a space. And I keep using terms like space or location, because that's been my experience with environmental orgs. Is there is often a location that needs to be improved or preserved. But I think, this goes back to the previous point, which is, even on a day-to-day basis of the slice of life of how the sustained health and function of a location impacts the people around it, you can go right to those people, because I guarantee some of the people that give to your organizations are the same people that are impacted by those locations. So another really profound and I think oft overlooked tip, in communicating impact is the sense of bringing donors in as insiders. It's more than just keeping them apprised of what you're planning to do and what you are currently doing. It's previewing what it is you intend to do. Now, this is, not to say that you need to, group think or crowdsource every decision your organizations make. In fact, that would be disastrous if donors had input in every aspect of your operation. But I feel certain that there are elements of your mission and your operation that you may still be discussing or planning or just on the cusp of going public with, whether it's a strategic plan or, in this case, Colorado Public Radio shared updated floor plans, knowing, of course, that they weren't necessarily going to change where conference room A was going to be if the donors objected, but the sense that there was a presence or the availability for donors to be on our side of the table as changes are made or plans are being finalized is really powerful for donors. My best experience with that has been really in two major areas. One is sharing strategic plans in advance of their official go live date. And this is where it's not really stagecraft and you're not lying to donors, but there's a sense of like, well, we've spent a lot of time with our staff and our board and our key committee members to craft a strategic plan. And again, donors' presence or awareness in a preview sense isn't going to alter it dramatically, but just knowing a little bit in advance of it starting has just had a really profound effect with donors that I've worked with. Likewise, it's in the area of learning and listening sessions that donors can hear a little bit about what you intend to go, to the direct mail stream with before it happens. Again, this is to bring it back to our overall theme of communicating impact and how challenging that is. In this sense, the insider information isn't even necessarily tied to the impact of the mission. It's the intention, it's the plan, it's showing our work. And that concept alone can be really powerful for donors. I think what people in general get tired of is the notion that they give money to an organization and then something may or may not happen, but they don't know either way how the organization got from point A to point B with their help. So all that to say, you don't necessarily need to communicate, total victory as an impact or an outcome. It's more the incremental progress and the thoughtful and responsible stewardship of those donors' funds. I I really can't emphasize this next point enough. And I do acknowledge that the idea of having separate development and marketing teams is a luxury for many nonprofits. More often than not, you might be working in a very small, even single person shop, and you may be the head of marketing and development and public relations. But if you do have separate teams that work on social media, direct marketing, digital, I strongly encourage you to build those internal relationships. And as I was looking over these slides before we started today, it's a constant reminder that, and I don't say this disparagingly, but our industry is not rocket science. There is no really erudite technical expertise necessary to be a really strong major gifts fundraiser. But it takes a relentless commitment to authentic relationship building, communication, and stewardship. Which isn't to discount those qualities, because I think those are very difficult to master. But all that to say, some of these tips I'm sharing strike me as like, oh, well, of course I'd look at our direct marketing to determine what I'm going to send to donors. But I think you'd be surprised at how many organizations operate in such strict silos that some of the major gifts fundraisers might not even know what donors are receiving from the direct mail stream. So to the extent you can, and the extent that your efforts can be complementary to whatever else donors are seeing about your organization, that is really, I don't want to say easy, but it is a straightforward way to help streamline your flow of communication and present that compelling narrative. Another aspect of articulating what it is you do, how you do it, what you intend to do, and ultimately what you have done, is to bring in third-party sources. This is particularly valuable in the environmental space, where the notion of preserving something is simple, but the mechanics, whether it's legislative or regulatory or scientific, that underlie that mission, can get very complicated very quickly. And this is another balancing act where, what you don't want to do is send a donor a 50-page water quality report, or, do a 3-hour primer on what brownfields are and what remediation from the environmental law context are. But if you can provide a crisp 1 or 2 page synopsis of the complexities and the nuances of where your mission is going and what it requires, and all of the key players, especially written in that voice of the expert themselves, as filtered and tailored through the lens of being readable and concise and compelling, I think that will help increase the credibility with which you approach donors, and that in turn continues to develop the trust they have for your organization. So even if the mission is way far off in the distance, again, you're showing your work, you're enlisting the experts, you're bringing donors along with you, even when it gets complicated. This is another news story example that we sourced from one of our great clients. Again, this is a powerful ancillary tool for demonstrating impact, is to align your organization's mission and efforts with greater need as articulated in the media or by experts, and then greater efforts through the lens of those complicated and nuanced aspects of your mission. And finally, well, not finally, but next, this is what I mentioned earlier about sending donors simple, compelling, personal messages. This goes back to what I encourage you to do at the beginning, which is really take a close look at what engaged you and what engages you about your mission. Again, setting aside the idea that we may all stand next to our donors someday and say, well, mission is accomplished, our organization no longer needs to exist. We did it. I don't even think that's the goal of any nonprofits at this point. I mean, that would be great, but the reality is we will make incremental progress. And one of the ways to do that is to continue telling stories from the heart, whether it's your story or whether you can ask a donor of yours or a supporter to provide a testimonial about why they engage with you and what they'd like to see and how they perceive the impact that you make. I mean, that's really the foundation of this point is taking a step outside that urgency and the need to show an impact and be curious about how long-term supporters see it themselves. Because there's got to be something that keeps people giving apart from forgetting they set up an automatic withdrawal from their checking account. And I think you'd be surprised at how infrequent that conversation with donors happens. Checking in with people about not just are they willing to keep engaging with you and keep giving, but why? And that can be really powerful, not just with that donor, but if they're willing, sharing that story beyond the walls of that one conversation. So things to keep in mind, and I would love to hear more about how it is you face these challenges. I always go back to understanding your own motivation, but also having a very strong sense of what progress your organizations are making. And I don't mean the greater mission, because that's, like I said, that's a really tough thing when our missions are ongoing or may never have an endpoint. But I guarantee each of you individually and as related to your organizations are making an impact. It's just a matter of articulating it. And I think, the yellowish orange circle, the be bold in your conversations and your asks, that isn't necessarily tied to the solicitation itself. In fact, my philosophy about soliciting donors for their gifts is that moment should be the inevitable outcome of the strength of the relationship that you've built with them. And that sounds a little touchy-feely, and ultimately you will have to sit down and ask people for money. But the philosophy of, if you apply a consistent and authentic approach with people in a way that continually asks them to reassess and recommit to their engagement with your mission, I think at some point giving does become secondary to the relationship. So this is where you can engage with us. I will provide my contact information as well, but for now, I would love to just hear from you. What challenges are you running into? Do you have questions? Do you have great tips? Are there things I haven't thought of? There are, I guarantee it. Feel free to put it in the chat or just speak up. Yes.
Drew, this is Denise Lanza. I am Executive Director of the Morris Park Alliance. We support a county park system here in New Jersey.
Great. Hi, Denise.
And one of my challenges is that most of my donors are one-off. They are supporting a memorial bench, for example, or a memorial tree, or they are tied to a specific project. We're building a playground, we're putting in a picnic shelter, and they come in for that reason. So trying to go back out to them and say, hey, this is the great stuff that's happening in the parks. I don't know that they have that connection because they were connected for that one effort. Any suggestions?
Sure. And this is very common, and in fact, very common in the American Cancer Society example I was talking about. It's where you'll often have people give even 5-6 figure gifts, and then it was because they lost a loved one, and
Right.
might be even too painful to engage further. So as to the parks, let me ask you this, Denise, what is the usual, so what's the process if someone makes a gift for a bench? Money comes in, bench is built. What happens after that from your perspective?
I usually, the maintenance staff will often send me a photo of the bench once it's installed to let me know. And I turn around and send that back to the donor or the lead donor. For example, I'm working with a group right now. There's a person who's coordinating all the neighbors to to recognize this gentleman. So I will send a follow-up photo and say, hey, bench is put in, here's a shot of it, here's the park where it is, here's how you can find it. So that's kind of I guess the last touch for that particular effort.
Okay. And how does that compare to your communication strategy with your regular sustainers?
Yeah, there's a couple of folks that every year, the end of the year, I get, a check.
Okay.
And so I probably about 3 times a year, I would follow up with them and kind of say, here's what we're working on, or, we were able to finalize this particular project. Here's a photo of the new picnic shelter we just put in, or, something along those lines. Yeah.
Sure. I think so. Bearing in mind that likely most of those people that make memorial gifts won't end up as lifelong sustainers. I think there are some not time intensive steps you could take afterward just as a process. I think you're doing a great job stewarding and updating them when the construction happens, and that is excellent. I might follow that with 1 or 2 additional outreaches, maybe a short survey that is curious about, well, why did they choose this park in particular, this location? And at that point, that might be your inflection point. If they engage further and say, well, I used to always come here as a kid, that kind of response would be like, okay, I'll put them in my, let's keep in warm, maybe semi-regular contact with them.
Mhm.
If the answer is like, I saw a link online, build a bench, then, it's like, well, thank you so much. That's great. I think it's a way to quickly triage, and I think, again, acknowledging that it's a minority of people that will have that follow-on story, it might just help capture, oh, well, I'd love to hear more about that. That can
Yeah,
turn
actually, I'm
into-
glad you said that because that sometimes comes up in the initial conversation.
Mm.
I'll get a phone call and they'll say, hey, we're looking for a bench for dad. He always walked at that park.
Oh, that's great.
So yeah, that's a good extra piece of information to capture that. I don't think I've really been capturing that.
Yeah, then if it's organic in the pre-construction phase, then you might just keep a post-it note of criteria that if you hear them say that it's a place they used to visit, or the person they're memorializing did, or if they moved to the area, or if they still have family in the area, those indicators will say, oh, okay, well then, once this is all done, and I think no matter how you communicate, it's previewing what you're going to do and then doing it and then following up. It's like, oh, well, here's the timeline on building this bench. When it's done, I'd love to send you a picture. And then if it's okay with you, I'd love to chat for 15 minutes a couple weeks later. It's, just previewing and asking permission. And if they're not interested, that's okay too.
Right. Yes, thank you.
Welcome. Other questions? I see a hand from Lois.
Hi, our program is the Sustainable Gardening Library, and we don't really have activities, where people can get together. Like, we don't do events because we just don't have the bandwidth for that. And something like a gala or other fundraising activities would be out of the question. But my question to you is more along, we're providing information on sustainable gardening, farming, and land use.
Mhm.
And so we don't have anything tangible, like a lot, it's like buy a plant or, plant 15 trees or something like that. That's not something that we can offer people. I would be curious what approach you might suggest for us.
Sure. Well, I think, this is where, what a nonprofit can provide is either the tangible outcome or I think playing a role as a community connector. And it sounds like yours falls into the latter, where even if, big events or anything that requires extensive planning or cost might be out of the question, you might consider approaching donors who are, otherwise somehow invested or as knowledgeable partners about land use or sustainability to come and be a guest speaker or host a. Can you tell me a little bit about the location itself?
There is no location.
Oh, all right. Then,
It's 100% online. It's a born digital library, and our collaborators are public gardens, universities, and government agencies that provide they sign on to become information providers.
Okay.
And the purpose of that is to make sure that the information we're providing is vetted and authoritative.
Mhm.
So the idea is that instead of searching all over the web for, native plants and pollinators and one subject and another subject, that you can go directly to the library. And right now we have 40 curated topics and 100 collaborators. So
All right.
yeah.
Well, in that case, because you have these partners that do have locations, you might consider reaching out to one or more of them to provide space and time for a brief talk on what it is you do, or a small gathering that would be free and accessible, information session, an opportunity for people who have used your library or are curious about the information to meet each other and hear more, because it sounds like there's a close connection between people who use the services and people who are interested in those topics that are adjacent to it. So native plants might be of interest to a gardening club or or some kind of affinity group that may already have ties to the university or the local government spaces. I think, though, it'd be important to go back to the foundation of, so what is the biggest challenge you're facing as far as, is it reliable funding? Is it getting people aware of your resources? What would you say is
It's kind of both. Up to this point, we've had a very small number of foundations and major donors that have supported the project since 2015.
Okay.
And I really need to expand that base. And we've determined that, we've done a few experiments, and, because of the bandwidth issue, we're thinking we need to stay focused on the foundations and major grants,
Okay.
just because, it's kind of easier for me to
Mhm.
get $5,000 from one place than it is to get, 50 times 100 donors.
Certainly.
And then the 2023, we're focusing on marketing outreach. So we are trying to do both things to get the word out about the library and also to acquire new donors.
Mhm. Well, it sounds like you have a core dedicated base of supporters already. You might consider asking their advice for, how they would like to see the initiative grow. And more important, I think, making specific asks, not for money, but for them to provide a written or a short video testimonial about what it is they found compelling about your mission. I'm just thinking of
We do have a good library of testimonials.
all right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a
Those
great jumping off point. I'm trying to think of things that are, low or no cost and can help shoulder some of the actual production of content. So
I think I was more interested in conceptually of, what kinds of things would appeal to new donors, along the lines of the presentation you gave today. What would be a good focus for us?
Well, I think, anything that can concisely articulate why it is you exist and what it is you can help people accomplish with your library, with your information. Again, that kind of goes back to, if you could talk to some of your donors about what is it they use your information for, then I think the second step would be looking at the populations where they are using that information. So the only thing I could think of would be like a gardening, if you wanted to know more about native plants, but where typically when people avail themselves of your information resources, well, what do they do with it?
Well, that's the part that we don't know. I mean, we don't know. It's like any library, somebody comes in and, gets a book out. It's like, did they actually read the book? Did they give the book to somebody else to read? We don't have any way to determine what they do with that. We do have a number of projects in the live, demonstration project type things that show what can be done with the information. I'm not sure I'm understanding your question either.
Oh, no, I think you answered it just perfectly. I think, my advice would kind of be the same as, if you don't currently know you may never know what everyone who interacts with you is doing with the information, but if there is that dedicated base of supporters, I would start with chatting with anyone in that group that you can and hearing about their experience with what they use the information for. At least that will give you a sample of what might be, the connection between offering information and where you might find new donors.
Right, I got it. Yeah, it's interesting. Our most used app is one that I never would have thought, and I don't know who's using it or what they're using it for.
This sounds like a potential great Agatha Christie mystery. I want to read more. I'm on my way, Lois.
Thank you.
Sorry not to have a really crisp answer. Does anyone else have any insight to that question? Because it's a really interesting one. This is germane to every nonprofit. How do we engage with people who are maybe new to giving or new to our organizations when maybe we don't have big marketing budgets or events? Anyone can jump in, or we can move on to another question.
I'll jump in and say something bravely.
Yeah. Okay.
By the way, thank you, Drew. This was really helpful. And I like that you started off talking about gut checks, because I really feel like my organization, while we work with partners, is the best to handle the task at hand, which is protecting one of New Jersey's largest lake. Something in the realm of little things that you can do that I'm trying to do more and more of is, and I work with a communications person on staff, it's just the donor touches, like the emails we put out to donors, whether we segment them or it's to the whole group, is I've been trying to find small ways that they can be interactive. Like just they always pose a little question, or we ask them to like hit a quick reply and give us their Valentine's 2-line poem for the lake, something, just something to get a response back and just see who's responding. And it's always like a broad array of people, and it's something easy and costs nothing to do, is just to try to make every outreach somehow interactive in like a genuine way without it feeling too forced. But it's been really fun to see people have fun sending in things or replying to things, and not just pushing info out to learn more about them.
I love that. I think that's
Fun.
jumped to my top of the list of tips for communication. Thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, breakthroughs, moments of clarity? If not, Caitlin, that's got me thinking. Something I always talk to my clients about when they're planning communications is actually very similar to making things interactive. It's treating communication with each donor as an endless timeline rather than just points in space, where even if I send you something every month, but it has a kind of a closed door sense to it, where it's like, this happened, talk to you next month, it is much less effective than if you can create themes, even if they're monthly, quarterly, or a year, and say, so this is happening now, and it previews and anticipates your next outreach, even to the point of, the foundation of the Veritus method is permission-based asking. So always being transparent about when we're going to ask donors anything, whether it's to have a conversation or to meet for coffee or to give a 10-figure gift, which is, all the time. But, that can, you can mimic that in your communications, where if you talk to someone on the phone and have 15 minutes, make sure to say, I would love to explore blank sometime in the future. Is it okay if I call you again in 2 months? So it's moving people along, and then it doesn't just give the impression that you're building a relationship. You are genuinely building a relationship. So I see there's something in the chat. Kind of new to fundraising. Is a major gift the same as getting a corporate sponsor? In the context of what I'm talking about, Jennifer, we use the term major gifts as a contrast to mid-level gifts, and that's entirely based on amount given by an individual. So a corporate gift would be more a business gives, but in the individual giving sector, whether it's a person making a large planned gift down to a membership, that's all the world of individual giving. Major is just shorthand for a certain dollar amount typically, and by extension, the attention that gift officers pay to steward those donors.
Thank you for explaining that.
No problem. Yeah, I realize a lot of the parlance of fundraising it seems so simple, but it is impenetrable, because like we know what all these words mean, but in a vacuum rather than in context. So, all right.
We have any last minute questions for Drew before we stop the recording session of our meeting? Well, with that, Drew, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And we
Thank
look
you.
forward to seeing more from Virtuous.
Thank you.